Welcome. It is Verdict with Senator Ted Cruz. Ben Ferguson with you. It is nice to have you with us as we are doing part 2 of our in-depth conversation on Venezuela. What has happened since Maduro has left? What is next? And Senator, we've got 3 different things we're going to talk about. And if people missed episode 1, it's one that really went viral. So make sure you go back and listen to it. But we're going to go in-depth again in this episode on 3 major different aspects of this story.
Well, listen, episode 1, which came out Monday, we did a deep dive into, number one, what happened? What happened in Venezuela? What President Trump did, sending in the military to capture and arrest Nicolas Maduro and his wife. We secondly discussed why Venezuela matters. What are the geopolitical consequences of Venezuela, the massive oil reserves, the massive gold reserves and other minerals. We talked about why Russia and China and Iran and Hezbollah were all in Venezuela. And finally, we did a very careful explanation of the legal basis, the legal authority for why President Trump had the authority to order this attack, to order this arrest. We laid it out in detail. We're seeing a lot of Democrats and the media and law professors, all of which are coming from exactly the same place, claiming this is illegal, this was a kidnapping. All of that is nonsense. And if you didn't listen to Monday's podcast, you should go back and I lay out the legal basis. And in fact, the opinion from the U.S. Department of Justice for the January 3rd, 1990 arrest of Manuel Noriega in Panama under very similar circumstances. And so those are 3 big questions we addressed. Today, we're going to address 3 additional questions. Number one, a lot of folks are asking, who is the First Lady of Venezuela, and why was she arrested? Why was she included in there? We're going to lay out some more detail as to what her background is. Secondly, we're going to talk about what are the geopolitical consequences of Maduro being arrested, being prosecuted, for the rest of Latin America and for the Western Hemisphere. They are significant. We're going to break them down carefully and systematically. And finally, and this is important, we're going to talk about what's next in Venezuela, what we can expect in the days and weeks and months ahead. What does this mean? What's the leadership going to be in Venezuela? And what should the United States want to happen next in Venezuela? All of that on today's pod.
Yeah, it's really going to be a fun one. Want to also talk to you real quick about our friends at Compassion International. There's an invisible thread that connects humans across distance. You can't see it, but you can feel it when you pull. And when a child in Guatemala learns to read, you feel it. The thread vibrates with every new word they master. When a teenager in Kenya gets medical care that saves their sight, that thread pulls tighter. And when a young woman in the Philippines breaks her family cycle of poverty, you're standing there with her. And here's what's remarkable. That thread goes both ways. Because while you're changing their life, they're changing yours too. Their resilience inspires you. Their joy reminds you what matters. Their letters become the highlight of your day. It is the powerful thread of Compassion International. Just hold one end of the thread. You'll stay connected through letters, photos, updates, prayers. The other end is a child who changed everything, including you. So impact the world, one child at a time. Learn how at compassion.com. That's compassion.com. All right, so Senator, we're going to pick it up literally where we left off in Monday's pod. And there have been so many questions about the wife of Maduro. Why was she arrested? Why was she charged? Why was she brought to America? I had to watch some of the crazy liberals and debate them on TV. They're angry that she was arrested instead of others around Maduro that they would have rather have had arrested. It was the argument that was being made, which just made my head explode as I was listening to the incompetence. But let's go through why she was actually indicted, why she's being held, why she's arrested, and why she's probably going to be found guilty of a lot of major crimes.
Yeah, look, she has been indicted, she has been charged, and she's being prosecuted. And yes, she is Maduro's wife. She is also a lawyer. She's a longtime Hugo Chavez loyalist. She's a communist. She's a Marxist. She is viciously anti-American.
Yes.
She is corrupt. She was intimately involved in the narco trafficking that Maduro was engaged in. She has been sanctioned by the Treasury Department for her involvement in that. And she's also been a senior government official. And in fact, here, I'm going to give you some of the background that the New York Post reported. So Cilia Flores was arrested. Cilia Flores is the first lady. She has been called the Latin Lady Macbeth. She's 69 years old, and she's been described by a former head of intelligence in Venezuela as being, quote, behind the curtain, pulling the strings. And here's what one prosecutor in the Maduro government said, quote, she is a fundamental figure in corruption in Venezuela, absolutely fundamental, and especially in the structure of power. And he continued, many people consider her far more astute and shrewd than Maduro himself. Now, what is her background? Her background, she was a lawyer for Hugo Chavez, the original Marxist who took over Venezuela, was elected and drove the economy into the ground. She has been nicknamed, in addition to Latin Lady Macbeth, she's been nicknamed First Warrior. And she's accused of accepting massive bribes from drug dealers. And in fact, her nephews, and in fact, they've been called her narco nephews, were both previously arrested in the United States for cocaine trafficking. And they plan to use the money from their drug sales, this is the narco nephews, to fund Flores's 2015 campaign for National Assembly in Venezuela.
Yep.
She is a political leader. She is alleged to have participated in the trafficking of cocaine, quote, much of which had been seized by Venezuelan law enforcement with the assistance of armed military escorts, that's according to the indictment, while guarded by, quote, state-sponsored gangs known as colectivos. And the gangs, according to the indictment, were to, quote, protect their drug trafficking operation.
By the way, 10 years ago, it had to be at least 10 years ago now, I went back to a conversation I had in New York City in the green room at Fox. There was a Venezuelan dissident, basically, that had been put into exile, and we were sitting talking about the oil and the narco-terrorism. This was over a decade ago from him. And they described the wife to me as, quote, not a housewife, but a brilliant mastermind. They said that Chavez would have never gotten to where he was without her being behind him, that she was able to really, and as you mentioned, a lawyer. They said she's very smart. She understands how to set this stuff up. She understands how to work it to the family's advantage and to make money. And the idea, they were laughing basically as they were describing, they're like, if you think this is just some first lady, in essence, a housewife, you are mistaken. She is ruthless to the core, as they described it, saying that she was a businesswoman that the mob would even be afraid of.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I mentioned Flores got her start with Hugo Chavez. Actually, Hugo Chavez was arrested in the wake of a failed coup attempt in 1992, and Flores stepped forward as his lawyer. And in fact, she was such a socialist and such a Marxist, she was literally spray painting Chavez's names on walls around Caracas. And she stepped forward. She represented Hugo Chavez pro bono for free. And she ended up getting him out of jail in 1994 before he ever stood trial. And she met Maduro while being an activist for Chavez. And Chavez was elected president in 1998, and Maduro and Flores both served under Chavez. She was attorney general.
Yep.
And he was vice president. And this, she is someone intimately involved in the corruption, in the drug trafficking, and that's why she's been arrested. It's why she is indicted, and it's why I believe both she and her husband will be convicted.
It really is interesting to see how the media has just gone to like compassion on this, where they're just like, well,
she's just a sweet little old lady.
Yeah,
why are you picking on this sweet little old lady?
Yeah, and
sweet little old lady, attorney general. sweet little old lady, attorney general, narco-terrorist, drug trafficker. But other than that, she's a sweet little old lady.
Yeah, this is why I, by the way, love doing this show, because no one else is talking about this. And I hope people that listen, they're like, okay, well, now we know. So you can correct the record. And people are like, well, it was just an easy one for them to grab. So they grabbed her. No, this is a woman who literally helped set up all of this corruption and was heavily involved in it. Which brings me to the big issue, and we've seen a lot of conversation about this as well by the talking heads, members of Congress that you serve with. And the word that I wrote down was Western Hemisphere. There has been a fever pitch of Western Hemisphere and how Venezuela fits into this and what happens if China or Russia or Iran, Cuba gets involved, X, Y, and Z in Venezuela. Can we just take a half a step back, explain politically what the meaning of Western Hemisphere means for people that maybe don't understand why it's so important and how it relates to national security with the United States of America as a broader point before we go into then why so many other countries want to be involved in Venezuela?
Yeah, look, the Western Hemisphere is just North America and South America. It's our half of the world. It's the and also the Caribbean islands but it's essentially the land that has the Atlantic Ocean on the east and the Pacific Ocean on the west, and the Western Hemisphere is distinct from the Eastern Hemisphere, which is Europe and Asia and Africa and Australia. All of that's in the Eastern Hemisphere. But the Western Hemisphere, going back to the very earliest days of America, where the Monroe Doctrine laid out that we are going to protect the Western Hemisphere. This is our hemisphere, and we talked about in Monday's podcast how Donald Trump believes very much in the Monroe Doctrine, so much so that it's now being widely referred to as the Donroe Doctrine, because he's put his own stamp on it. And I'm going to give a couple of stories to give some context, because I think this is massively consequential for other countries in the Western Hemisphere and for U.S. national security. I mentioned on Monday's pod that the Office of Legal Counsel is who prepared the legal memorandum that laying out the basis for arresting Noriega in Panama. And I mentioned that Bill Barr was the head of the Office of Legal Counsel who wrote that memo, but I also mentioned that there had been lots of very respected lawyers who had headed OLC, including Antonin Scalia, including William Rehnquist, and I mentioned Chuck Cooper, who was my very first boss when I came from clerking for Chief Justice Rehnquist, and I was a 27-year-old lawyer. My first boss was Chuck Cooper. He's one of the top Supreme Court litigators in the country. And as it so happened, we recorded Monday's pod Sunday evening, and then we finished recording the pod, and I went to have dinner with Chuck. So I literally went to Chuck's house as soon as we finished recording, and he told me a story I didn't know, which is during the Reagan administration, Chuck, as a young 30-something lawyer, was the one that Reagan sent down to Panama to negotiate with Noriega.
No way.
And so he went down there, and he was sort of laughing. He was like, I was the only one kind of foolish enough to accept the assignment. And he went down, and he said, Noriega came and arrived in like a caravan of big armored cars, and he had all sorts of soldiers with automatic weapons. And, Chuck sitting there as this, young lawyer from DOJ, and they were trying to negotiate Noriega's leaving voluntarily. And he was going to leave voluntarily and go to a third country, and he could live in exile and live in peace. And by the way, Trump tried to do the same thing, which is negotiate with Maduro. If you want to leave in peace, we'll let you leave in peace. And Noriega and Maduro both made the same stupid mistake. They said, no, I'm not going to leave. And Chuck told me, he said he was negotiating, and Noriega was like, absolutely not. I'm not going anywhere. That will never happen. And Chuck told me he finished the meeting at the end of the meeting, and he said, Mr. President, I need to tell you something, which is I'm going to leave now. I'm going to go back to the United States. But people are going to come after me, and they're not going to take no for an answer. And he did that.
By the way, isn't it amazing that Chavez, this happened to him, Maduro saw it, Maduro's wife saw it, and they still
not Chavez, Noriega.
Noriega, excuse me.
It's hard to keep these Latin American dictators straight.
Exactly. But you see it, it's like you would think they would look at the history and be like, okay, we know how this ends. Like, we understand how this ends. And yet, it's there. Like, they can see it. It's tangible. They can see the fallout afterwards. They can see how it went down. And then when Donald Trump calls you and is like, hey, man, like, we'll let you leave. Like, we're literally letting you leave if you'll just leave. And he's like, nope, never leaving. You can. And then he goes out on stage. You can come and get me, you coward. Well, okay, we did it.
Yeah, no, he was literally chanting and screaming at Trump, calling him a coward in Spanish, cobarde. And, well, it turned out he said, come and get me. And Trump said, oh, okay. And he did. And that, look, in terms of Latin America, I'll tell you also yesterday, I spoke with President Trump and in the Oval, and we talked about a lot of topics. But I told him, I said, listen, congratulations on the Venezuela attack, on the arrest. I said, Mr. President, candidly, that took cast iron balls to issue that order, because frankly, it could have gone wrong 1,000 different ways. And there's
also part of it when you make those orders that I think people don't realize. You've been around it, and I've been around it. You are making a decision that very well could cost an American their lives.
Well, and the president and I talked about that.
That's a lot. I mean, people don't realize, I think, how much that weighed even on President Bush when I was around him, when he knew that there were Americans dying because of the decision that you're making. Donald Trump, I think, really understands that as well.
Yeah, and we talked about that, and we both talked about, we marveled at the incredible military precision that they carried out. The fact that this attack, they went in and they landed in the middle of a major metropolitan city with 5 million people. They landed in the middle of a huge military base. It's been now publicly reported that there were 32 Cuban soldiers guarding Maduro, all of whom were killed.
Yeah.
And we did not lose a single U.S. serviceman who was there. 2 were shot, but neither was killed. And I'll tell you something, a fact I learned today, which I didn't know, which is when they had Maduro and the First Lady, and the Cuban security forces were opening fire on them, and then they were engaged in a firefight.
Yeah. Our
soldiers blocked Maduro and the First Lady with their own bodies. Now, they had body armor, but they were trying to make it an arrest. They actually treated it under the protocol for a hostage extraction because they didn't want them shot in the process. They wanted them to come back to the United States and face prosecution and face justice. And so you want to talk about the bravery of Delta Force literally putting their bodies with body armor in front of Maduro and the First Lady so that they didn't get shot by the Cubans. That's extraordinary. And I got to say, so when I was talking with President Trump, he actually asked me, he brought up in the first term his taking out General Soleimani in Iran.
Yeah.
He talked about his taking out al-Baghdadi. He talked about his launching the military bombing attack on the nuclear facilities in Iran. And he talked about this, and all of them were spectacular successes. And actually, President Trump asked me a question. He said, Ted, which was more important? The nuclear facilities in Iran or arresting Maduro? And I actually stopped.
That's a hard one.
I said, Mr. President, that is a very good question. And I said, to be honest, it's really close. If you forced me to answer that, here's what I would say. I think taking out the nuclear facilities in Iran was more important. Geopolitically, in terms of our national security, the Ayatollah with nuclear weapons could have murdered vast numbers of Americans. And so taking out those nuclear facilities made America much, much safer. But I said, arresting Maduro is a very close second because it changed the entire geopolitical balance of power in the Western Hemisphere. And it's interesting. The president said, I agree. That's exactly how I would rank those two. And so it was an interesting, Trump is rarely, I would say, deeply introspective. That's not just his nature. And he was kind of reflecting on that. And we had a good conversation. And to be honest, I hadn't, until he asked me that question, I hadn't really thought of. But hands down, those are the two most important foreign policy decisions that he's made. And in terms of the Western Hemisphere, what does that mean? Well, let's take Cuba. Cuba is probably the country most impacted. We talked about this a little on Monday's pod. So Cuba, for years, it's a communist dictatorship. It's been under communist control since Fidel Castro led a revolution that succeeded in 1959. And the people, just like Venezuela, the communists in Cuba destroyed the economy. The people suffer in misery and poverty. But they've been ruthless. And for many decades, they survived in significant part because the Soviet Union sent them vast amounts of money. And so they were a satellite power of the Soviet Union. Obviously led to things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Soviets were trying to put missiles in Cuba to target the United States. But in the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, suddenly Cuba did not have that financial lifeline anymore.
Yeah.
And when that happened, the country that stepped in was Venezuela. And because Venezuela has these massive oil reserves and at the time still had significant money, essentially the trade-off that Venezuela has done for years is Venezuela sends massive amounts of oil to Cuba, and it fuels the Cuban economy, what little of it there is. And Cuba, in effect, pays for it by sending thugs, by sending soldiers and guards. And the Cuban thugs, they repress the Venezuelan people, they murder people, they torture people. But look, it speaks volumes that Maduro's guards were the 32 Cubans who were guarding him. I mean, that's literally his armed forces around him.
It wasn't Venezuelan armed forces, it was Cubans.
And President Trump is continuing to enforce the oil blockade, so there is not Venezuelan oil flowing to Cuba right now. That is putting massive pressure on the Cuban economy. And I got to say, the communist leadership there is looking around. And number one, you want to talk about their military prowess. They had 32 soldiers guarding Maduro. All 32 Cuban soldiers are dead. Not a single U.S. soldier lost his life. They're sitting there going, okay, our days are numbered. And I'm hopeful one of the consequences of this will be a free Cuba, that the communist regime falls in Cuba.
And that could be a fall because of just the economy totally collapsing and the lack of the lights literally staying on because of the oil not showing up.
Yes, and I'll say more broadly, dictatorships depend upon the perception of strength, the perception of invulnerability. We're seeing this play out in Iran right now. In Iran, there are protests all over Iran on the streets, and the people are rising up. And regular listeners of Verdict will recall that in the wake of President Trump ordering the bombing on the Iranian nuclear facilities, I predicted on this podcast, I said, I think the Ayatollah and the mullahs, their days are numbered, and here's why. The Ayatollah lost a war, and there are real consequences in the real world when you lose a war. Now, first, they lost the 12-day war to Israel, and Israel took out all of their air defenses, took out much of their senior leadership, took out much of the IRGC, took out the head of the IRGC literally day after day after day. They kept appointing someone new, and he was killed the next day. And if you are a radical Islamist leader who not only loses a war, but loses a war to Israel.
Yeah.
You know what? You ain't the supreme leader anymore. You look weak and ineffective, and there's no ambiguity about it. There's no amount of spinning that can say, no, we didn't lose. And then you put on top of that, the President of the United States bombs into oblivion your nuclear facilities. And what I said is, look, we don't have to send in the U.S. military to Iran for the regime to fall. The regime is so weakened, my hope is the Iranian people will rise up. And I think there's a real possibility that's happening right now, and they are weakened. Well, the same is true. Certainly Venezuela, the fact that Maduro was captured has weakened the communist regime there. But the communist regime in Cuba, the fact that their soldiers were just obliterated, like it weakens Iran, it weakens Cuba as well. And by the way, the same thing is true for Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, another communist, a Sandinista. The same thing is true for Gustavo Petro in Colombia, another radical left-winger who's viciously anti-American. And even Lula in Brazil. Now, Brazil is a more stable and stronger country than the other players. But Lula, likewise, every leftist in Latin America who hates America and hates President Trump is materially weaker, and I believe arresting Maduro is going to result in more freedom-loving and America-loving leaders in Latin America and more countries moving in the direction to be our friends. That's good for Latin America, but it's good for America.
And there's another country I want to ask you about, and that's Mexico.
Yeah.
You actually had a Codell, 3-4 months ago, where you went down into Latin America. I would be very interested to see how that Codell would go down today and what the conversations would be like with the leaders you met with today compared to then. Let's talk a little bit about Mexico. It's pretty clear now that people are accepting the fact that it's a failed state. The narco terrorists are in charge of it. The president of Mexico is a figurehead at best. There's a lot of people that are asking the question, is that now, I guess you could say, the reality of this because of what we are witnessing? And maybe she doesn't seem to be as strong as she was before. What does this mean for the narco terrorists there? And what does this mean for America's response? And is this also an opportunity with us to stop the flow of drugs? We've stopped the human trafficking. We've stopped the illegal immigrants coming across the border. That's amazing. But there's still a lot of drugs that are in Mexico that come into the United States of America, find their way in. So what does this do now for Donald Trump's hand and our national security, stopping the drugs the same way we did in Venezuela?
Yeah, look, so I think what you said about Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, is too strong. I would not describe Mexico as a failed state. Okay. And I think she is in a fundamentally different position than a Maduro or the other communist dictators in Latin America. She is a leftist. She's following AMLO, who was elected as a leftist. But listen, Mexico and the United States have massive trade and commerce back and forth. We cooperate on a great deal of matters. We've talked on this podcast before about Mexican water. There's a water treaty called the Water Treaty of 1944 that obligates Mexico to provide 350,000 acre-feet of water a year to South Texas. And under Biden, the Biden administration didn't enforce that treaty, and Mexico walked all over us and ended up being 1.3 million acre-feet of water in arrears. Now, what did that mean as a practical matter? It meant that the farmers in South Texas were facing a drought, not a natural disaster, but a man-made disaster. It was caused by the Mexican government defying their treaty obligations. And by the way, the Mexicans were diverting that water from South Texas to the farmers in northern Mexico. And so the drought in South Texas, you had farmers who were taking about half their acreage out of production, were laying off workers. The only sugar mill in Texas in 2024 closed down because of the drought caused by Mexico defying the treaty. And the farms in northern Mexico were lush and verdant. I mean, they were awash in water. And I spent the entire Biden presidency trying to get the Biden State Department to stand up to Mexico. They refused to do so. When Trump came in, I went to him directly and asked him, and in fact, I worked with him to draft a tweet that he sent that made very clear he threatened Mexico, if you don't give the water that Texas deserves, we're going to impose sanctions or tariffs. The day President Trump sent the tweet, and to be clear, it was a tweet that I helped write.
Yeah.
That night, Claudia Sheinbaum called an emergency cabinet meeting at 7 p.m. that evening to decide how to respond. And she responded by releasing about 400,000 acre-feet of water, which was enormously helpful to the farmers in South Texas. And then, just in December, the Mexicans had started slow-walking the water again. And so I went to Trump again. I went to the Oval. And I number one, I told him the story of like the emergency cabinet meeting, which I don't know that he had heard the blow-by-blow of what had happened. But then I said, look, they're slow-walking it again. Would you send another tweet? He said, sure, draft something for me and we'll do it. Within like a day or two, he sent out the other tweet, and he said, look, we're going to respond forcibly against Mexico unless you agree to provide us, they owe us for under the treaty a little over 800,000 acre-feet of water remaining, and Mexico agreed we're going to provide the water. So I will say, Mexico, look, Claudia Sheinbaum is no doubt disturbed by seeing Maduro weakened, and Mexico had to some extent aligned with the Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Colombia axis. But Mexico also has very close relationships with the United States, so it stands on a different footing. But you're right, in August, when I was in Mexico, meeting with senior government officials, I said, listen, you guys are either going to go after the narco traffickers who are in Mexico, the cartels who became massively powerful under Biden, or if you don't go after them, I said, I believe Donald Trump will. And they were skeptical. I got to tell you, one of my sort of senior foreign policy guy was on the trip with me, and he argued with me. And what he argued with me at the time is he said, I think Trump will go after Venezuela before Mexico. And I said, I don't know about that. I think the Mexican cartels, he's very focused on it. Well, it turned out he maintains we made a bet on it. I don't recall any wager, but he insists that we did.
I believe that there was a bet now. I totally believe it because I know who you're talking about. I'm going to side on this one for sure.
I am skeptical that there was any wager, but I will say you're right for Mexico also. I have every confidence that it is going to focus the mind of the administration that when the Trump administration says, let's go after the narco traffickers, they better cooperate or bad things can happen. And I think that's a great thing. And as I told the president yesterday when I talked to him, I said, listen, the world is safer. The world is better off. America is safer when we have a strong commander-in-chief as compared to a weak commander-in-chief, as compared to Joe Biden. And I'll tell you, Trump and I both talked about, we both immediately went to the same analogy, which was Jimmy Carter. When he sent in a rescue team to rescue our hostages in Iran in 1979, and that rescue team crashed in the desert. 2 helicopters crashed into each other, and there was no opposing fire. They hadn't even gotten there. They just crashed, and it was, and actually, Trump asked me the following question. He said, do you think Carter would have lost if those helicopters hadn't crashed? And I said, I don't know. It's a very good question. And he said, or if there hadn't been a hostage crisis? I said, that's a really good question. I said, I think Carter lost for 2 big reasons. One, the economy was a disaster and he'd screwed it up badly. And 2, the incredible weakness of the hostage crisis. Americans don't like a weak president. I think those 2 are what elected Ronald Reagan. And I told President Trump, I said, we don't have to go all the way back to Carter. We can go to Joe Biden. Joe Biden lost and you won, number 1, because he screwed up the economy. And number 2, for the same thing, the foreign policy weakness. And it's why I said that President Trump showed so much courage by ordering this attack, because these things can go wrong. Now, I think part of the reason the military was so effective is he's taken the shackles off them and let them focus on war fighting, on doing their job, on being effective. You don't have a bunch of lawyers.
He's not DEIing it anymore, right? Like we were before. You don't have a bunch of dudes acting like chicks that are trying to get in the armed forces.
That's exactly right, and he allows them to focus on excellence and performing their job of keeping this country safe. And it was an extraordinary operation in Venezuela.
It really was. So let's go to Venezuela now and wrap with this. What is next? And let me just, I could look at my Twitter feed, and I was on CNN last night, and it was the topic of conversation, and that is, there are a lot of people that believe that America First policy that Donald Trump ran on was not invading countries and staying indefinitely like Iraq, Afghanistan. There is a lot of concern. I heard it. You probably saw the clip of Lindsey Graham on Air Force One with the president saying, this is a guy that loves to be in these forever wars. And there was people that were really concerned with that image of if that's who's in his ear. I don't want to get bogged down in Venezuela. I don't want our men and women to be there and loss of life to mount and grow because we decide to take over a country indefinitely. There's a lot of people that voted for Trump. They believe that's what he was never going to do. And now they're like, well, hold on. We're here. We're going to take it over. There is a lot of concern. So let's dive into that and talk about what this looks like next in Venezuela. What responsibility do we have to do it the right way, but also to not just sit there indefinitely?
Well, listen, first of all, let me be clear. We are not at war with Venezuela. This is not a forever war. It's not even a war. This was a military operation to execute an arrest warrant. It was the military supporting the FBI in arresting indicted narco-terrorists. And it took a couple of hours and was over. They went in, they got them, and they left. That was the conclusion of the military conflict. It's not a war. It's not, as I said, it's not a forever war. It was not even a 5-hour war. It was about a 2-hour war. And I wouldn't even call it a war. It was when you go and arrest someone. It was an arrest with the military supporting and protecting the law enforcement officers carrying out the arrest. What happens next? So the day after Maduro was arrested, Delcy Rodriguez, who was the vice president, was sworn in as the interim president. Now, listen, no American should be happy with Delcy Rodriguez as the president of Venezuela for any extended period of time. And I'm going to go into a little bit of background in terms of who she is and then talk about what should happen next. Now, Delcy Rodriguez is a communist.
Yes.
She was the vice president. She hates America. Let me give you some of her background. She was the vice president. Before that, she was the oil minister. And she is a lawyer, too, like the first lady. And she's been in just about every post. She was foreign minister. She was president of the Constituent Assembly, vice president and oil minister. She was sworn in as the interim president. You know who swore in?
Who's that?
Her brother, Jorge Rodriguez, who is the head of the National Assembly. So to understand, this is a corrupt, Marxist, communist, America-hating woman. And let me give you her background. She was born in Caracas. She is the daughter of a Marxist guerrilla leader named Jorge Antonio Rodriguez. And she is, rather, her dad was a co-founder of the Socialist League. Her dad was arrested in connection with the 1976 kidnapping of American businessman William F. Niehaus and died in police custody. And one source said the following: that ordeal is the foundation and origin of Delcy's hatred of the West and of democracy. Her whole background was Marxist. And in fact, the source continued, the guerrilla Marxist element kidnapped an American executive in 1976. He was held for 3 years until authorities located the group hiding in the Amazon jungle. She was sanctioned by the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Asset Control because of her senior role in the Maduro administration. Those sanctions are still in place. She was also caught transporting gold illegally into Spain. She had 40 bags full of gold in a private jet as the vice president. And they put the bags through the x-ray. They said, wait, you got 40 bags full of gold. And she's
like, I'm from Venezuela. This is normal. This is how we operate there. I'm the vice president, right? Like, that's no big deal.
Look, she is a communist leader. And she is not a friend of the West. Now, I will say this. Right now, it appears she's cooperating with the Trump administration. I'm sure it made an impression seeing Delta Force show up and arrest Maduro and the First Lady.
Yeah, because she could be next.
She's cooperating right now. We'll see if she continues to cooperate. By the way, there are multiple reports of violence on the ground. There have been reports of potential coups from other leaders in the government. There is some instability, but I'll tell you what needs to happen. No one should be happy. Number one, what you said is exactly right. We do not want to see an American occupation. We don't want to see an extended American presence on the ground. And we don't want to see this America-hating communist essentially the Maduro regime continuing. What should happen is free and fair elections. And free and fair elections, look, the last election, we talked about in the last podcast that Maduro was arrested because he's a narco-trafficker, but he was also arrested because he's illegitimate, because in the last election he lost decisively to the opposition party, and yet he stayed in power just as a thug and dictator, and that was part of the legal basis for why we could do this, because he was no longer legitimately a head of state, and he was not recognized as a head of state by the United States, including the Biden administration and much of the rest of the world. There should be free and fair elections, and I think it would be very, very good for Venezuela and very, very good for America if they were to elect a leader who is a pro-America, pro-free market leader, and Venezuela were to return to being a friend, particularly, look, one of the big things, they've got the largest proven oil reserves of any country in the world.
It really is amazing that if you think about the amount of oil they have and also gold, that how quickly they could come out of this if they just didn't have communists running the country. Like this would be one of the easiest. I was described today by a banker, and he was just trying to put it in perspective. He's like, when other countries fall, then they need the World Bank. They need people to come in and give them cash and to help just stabilize at the bare minimum of a total collapse of their economy. He said, if you ask me right now, what country would I want to be able to take over based on their resources to build them back up the fastest? He was like, Venezuela is like one of the easiest ones in the whole world to do because of how much they have to sell. They could get their economy up and roaring, and the people could have a great life. And they used to have that, by the way, in Venezuela. People forget that.
Yeah, remember in 1950, Venezuela had the fourth highest GDP per capita in the world. The United States was first, then Switzerland, then New Zealand, and Venezuela was number 4. That's what these communists screwed up. And listen, President Trump has focused a great deal on trying to get U.S. oil companies to go and invest in Venezuela. Now, to produce the oil, and even though they have proven reserves, their infrastructure has collapsed. It's the corruption of the communism. They're not producing what they could. And to be able to produce will take an investment of likely hundreds of billions of dollars. It's not a cheap proposition. Now, the oil that will be produced would generate more revenue than that. But I'll tell you, I actually spent a good chunk of the day talking to people in the energy industry and asking their views on Venezuela. And a big question that if you're, let's say you're the CEO of Chevron or the CEO of ExxonMobil and you're trying to decide, do I invest tens of billions or hundreds of billions? Your number one question is, what's the government there? Are they stable? Is there rule of law? Are they going to protect me? Are they going to seize? Am I going to invest $100 billion and they come seize the assets like they did before? If you don't trust the government there to protect your property rights, you're not going to invest. And it's why having free and fair elections and a stable government that is friends of the United States, that is not communist, is critical to the success not just of Venezuela, but to the success of America's relationship with Venezuela. And so I will say, you know, there's some folks, you're seeing people who are saying, well, no, this was not regime change because we just arrested Maduro, but the exact same regime is in place. And let me be clear. This, I very much hope, will be regime change at the ballot box, which is a very different thing. That it will be the voters, that there will be a free and fair elections, and the voters will choose, we don't want these corrupt Marxist narco-traffickers. We want a leader that we choose to represent us and to bring us back to prosperity. And if you want prosperity in Venezuela, you want free enterprise, you want incentives for investment to develop the massive natural resources, and you want to trade with the United States of America. And so that's the outcome all of us should be rooting for. And I believe that's the outcome President Trump is working very hard to produce.
Yeah, it's gonna be very interesting to see. We're going to keep covering it. I can promise you that. Don't forget, we do the show Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And if you missed part 1 of our deep dive into Venezuela and what has happened, make sure you go back and grab Monday's podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And also, you can watch our episodes on YouTube. Subscribe to the channel there. It's free. Also on Facebook, you can do that as well. Follow the Senator and I on X, and we will keep you up to date on everything going on in the world. And the Senator and I will see you back here Friday morning.